April 18, 1962, Vienna. Conrad Xander adjusted his tie and stared at his reflection in the hotel mirror. 6 years with the CIA, and he still couldn't shake the feeling that everyone could see right through him. The heavy curtains of the hotel sacker filtered the morning sunlight, casting the room in a golden haze that did nothing to warm the chill in his bones. Outside, Vienna hummed with springtime energy. But for Conrad, the beautiful city remained a chessboard where one wrong move meant checkmate. The phone rang, jolting him from his thoughts. 3 rings. A pause. 2 more rings. The signal. Yes. Conrad answered, keeping his voice neutral. The package requires inspection at 1100. Café Central. The line went dead. Conrad replaced the receiver and checked his watch, a Rolex Submariner, standard issue for field operatives who needed to blend with the European business class. He had 2 hours before the meeting. Just enough time to follow protocol. Check for surveillance, establish a cover pattern, and verify his exit routes. As he left the hotel, he reminded himself of his core belief, the one that had driven him to join the agency after his time at Yale. America needed men willing to operate in the shadows to preserve freedom in the light. But lately, that conviction had begun to waver. 6 years of half-truths and compromised principles wore on a man. Vienna was a city divided, not physically like Berlin, but in spirit. Soviet and Western intelligence officers prowled its elegant streets, each cataloging the other's movements while the Viennese pretended not to notice. Conrad followed his standard counter-surveillance route, doubling back through the Stadtpark, boarding a tram only to exit 1 stop later, and pausing at a newspaper kiosk to observe reflections in the shop windows across the street. Clean, or they were too good to spot. Café Central stood as it had for decades, an architectural marvel housing one of Vienna's most storied coffee houses, and a favorite meeting spot for case officers and their assets. Conrad arrived 30 minutes early, chose a table with a view of both entrances, and ordered a mélange and Apfelstrudel he had no intention of finishing. At exactly 11, she walked in. Julia Vaughn, or that's what he knew her as, cultural attaché at the American Embassy and, unofficially, his CIA liaison for the past 4 months. Her chestnut hair was pulled back in a simple chignon. Her navy blue dress appropriately conservative for a diplomatic function. She carried a leather portfolio and the day's edition of Die Presse. "Darling, sorry I'm late," she said, kissing his cheek as she sat down. Maintaining their cover as colleagues with a personal relationship, the ambassador simply wouldn't stop talking. "You're right on time," Conrad replied, noticing the tension around her eyes despite her smile. "Everything all right at the embassy?" "Oh, the usual bureaucratic nonsense. Nothing worth discussing." She ordered a coffee from the waiter, then opened her portfolio. "I brought those cultural exchange documents for you to review." This was their routine. Documents passed in public, the contents disguised as mundane diplomatic papers. When the waiter stepped away, she slid a folder across the table. "Director wants eyes on this immediately," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Conrad glanced at the folder. "Priority. Highest. We've intercepted communications suggesting the Soviets are developing a new approach to influence operations. Something using American commercial products." He raised an eyebrow. "Commercial products? Specifically Coca-Cola." Conrad nearly laughed. "You can't be serious." "Deadly serious." Moscow Center believes American cultural exports are their greatest vulnerability. They've been experimenting with methods to turn our own products against us. "What exactly am I looking for?" Julia sipped her coffee, her eyes scanning the cafe. "There's a Soviet chemist named Dmitry Petrov who defected last month. He was working on a program to modify Coca-Cola distributed in neutral countries, adding compounds that would make consumers more receptive to Soviet messaging. Mind control through soda pop? Conrad couldn't keep the skepticism from his voice. "Not mind control. Subtle behavioral influence. The compounds allegedly reduce anxiety and increase suggestibility. She leaned forward. The Soviets planned to use altered Coca-Cola in diplomatic functions, summit meetings, anywhere East meets West for negotiations. Conrad flipped through the folder, studying the chemical formulas. His background in chemistry before the agency made him valuable for this kind of assessment. These compounds, they're similar to mild anxiolytics, but combined with caffeine and sugar. He frowned. It's theoretically plausible. Where's Petrov now? That's the problem. He's disappeared. Last seen in Zurich 3 days ago. We think the KGB has a retrieval team after him. And my role? Find him before they do. The director believes this operation goes beyond Petrov. Someone highly placed in Coca-Cola international distribution must be involved. We need to identify the Soviet asset and determine how far this operation has spread. Conrad closed the folder. I'll need more resources. You'll have them. There's a dead drop in the Belvedere Gardens with operational funds and documentation. Recognition code. Prater wheel tickets are overpriced. Response. But the view is worth the wait. As they finished their coffee, Julia passed him a silver cigarette case. A small gift, she said with a smile. Inside was a microfilm concealed in the lining, contact information for local assets who could help. After Julia left, Conrad remained at the cafe, contemplating the bizarre assignment. The Cold War had reached a new level of psychological warfare if the Soviets were now tampering with Coca-Cola. A symbol of American capitalism so potent that its very presence behind the Iron Curtain represented Western influence. He paid his bill and walked to the Belvedere Gardens, maintaining his counter-surveillance routine. The spring flowers were in full bloom, tourists snapping photos of the historic palace. Conrad sat on a bench near the reflecting pool, next to an elderly man feeding pigeons. Prater wheel tickets are overpriced, Conrad commented casually. The man never looked up from his birds. But the view is worth the wait. When the man left, he'd abandoned his newspaper on the bench. Conrad took it, feeling the weight of a key taped inside. The key opened a locker at the Subenhof railway station. Inside, he found a briefcase containing 10,000 Austrian shillings, a Czech passport under the name Karel Novak, and a train ticket to Zurich departing that evening. Also included was a dossier on Dmitry Petrov and a sealed envelope with instructions to be opened only upon arrival in Switzerland. Conrad memorized Petrov's face. Mid-50s, receding hairline, wire-rimmed glasses. Then destroyed the photograph. The Soviet chemist had worked at a research facility outside Moscow for 15 years before his defection. His specialty: psychopharmacology and behavioral modification. By 7 that evening, Conrad was on the train to Zurich, the rhythmic clacking of wheels on tracks providing cover for any surveillance. He'd switched clothes, now wearing the tweed jacket and horn-rimmed glasses befitting a Czech academic. In the dining car, he ordered a Coca-Cola, examining the bottle with new suspicion before taking a careful sip. The sealed envelope contained his next contact, a man named Heinrich who worked for a Swiss pharmaceutical company that served as a CIA front. The company had helped Petrov initially but lost contact with him after delivering him to a safe house. Conrad arrived in Zurich just after dawn. The city was shrouded in mist rising from Lake Zurich, giving the financial capital an appropriate air of mystery. He checked into the Hotel Schweizerhof under his Czech identity and called the number for Heinrich. "I'm interested in touring your facility," Conrad said in German. "Professor Novak from Prague University. We offer tours on Thursdays only," came the reply. "Meet me at the reception at 10. Heinrich turned out to be a small, nervous man with meticulous habits. He drove Conrad to a nondescript office building in a commercial district outside the city center. Petrov was unstable from the beginning, Heinrich explained once they were secure in his office. Paranoid. He believed both sides were after him. He wasn't wrong, Conrad noted. Heinrich nodded. He kept detailed notes on the Soviet operation, what he called Project Harmony. The concept was ingenious in its simplicity. Coca-Cola already had established bottling operations in neutral countries. The Soviets had placed an asset high in the Coca-Cola export division who could ensure that specific chemical compounds were added to batches destined for diplomatic functions. Do we know who the asset is? Petrov only knew him as Cardinal, but he had evidence, formulas, shipping schedules, even recordings. Heinrich frowned. 3 days ago, Petrov became convinced he was being watched. He took all his documentation and fled the safe house. Where would he go? He mentioned a colleague at the University of Zurich, someone he trusted from an international conference years ago. Professor Jürgen Weber. We've had Weber under surveillance, but there's been no contact. Conrad studied the map of Zurich on Heinrich's wall. The Soviets will be watching Weber too. I need to get to Petrov first. What else do we know about his movements? Only that he withdrew a large sum from the account we established for him. And Heinrich hesitated. And what? He purchased a ticket for a boat tour of Lake Zurich the day he disappeared. Conrad considered this. A public place with multiple exit points. Smart. He was planning to meet someone. After leaving Heinrich, Conrad made his way to the lake. The tourist boats departed hourly, filled with visitors enjoying the alpine views. He purchased a ticket for the afternoon tour and spent the intervening hours observing the dock and surrounding cafes. On his third circuit around the departure area, Conrad noticed a man reading a newspaper at a lakeside cafe. The man had been there for at least an hour, his coffee long finished. Russian surveillance techniques often involved static observation posts rather than the more mobile Western approaches. Conrad found a position that gave him a view of both the dock and the observer. When the boat boarding began, he noticed the Russian observer tense slightly, his attention focusing on an elderly couple approaching the gangway. The woman matched no known description, but the man, though he had dyed his hair and was wearing dark glasses, had the same stoop-shouldered posture as Petrov. Conrad boarded the boat 2 groups behind them, maintaining distance. The Russian observer made no move to board, instead speaking rapidly into what appeared to be a radio concealed in his jacket. They were calling in a team. Once the boat was underway, Conrad moved carefully through the tourists, positioning himself near the elderly couple without drawing attention. The boat tour guide was describing the mansions along the lakeshore in 3 languages over a crackling speaker system. Beautiful day for a cruise, isn't it? Conrad said casually in Russian. The man stiffened but didn't turn. I'm not here to harm you, Dr. Petrov, Conrad continued quietly in English. But others are coming who will. We need to move quickly. Who sent you? Petrov's companion asked, her Swiss-German accent pronounced. I believe we have mutual concerns about modified beverage formulas, Conrad replied, using a phrase that would only make sense to someone familiar with the Coca-Cola operation. Petrov finally turned, his eyes darting nervously behind his dark glasses. They found me. Not yet, but they will. When this boat docks, there will be a reception committee. We have to get off before then, the woman said. She wasn't elderly at all, Conrad realized, just wearing an excellent disguise. I'm Margot Weber, she explained. Jürgen's sister. Dmitri contacted me when he felt he was compromised. The boat was approaching a small dock at a lakeside village. A brief stop on the tour for passengers to take photographs. We get off here, Conrad decided. Then immediate separation. Dr. Petrov comes with me. Ms. Weber, you continue alone to throw off any surveillance. The documentation, Petrov said urgently. It's not with me. I've hidden it. Where? In the one place they would never look. Inside the Coca-Cola bottling plant itself, Conrad felt a chill that had nothing to do with the lake breeze. There's a bottling plant in Zurich? The regional distribution center. I placed the evidence inside a maintenance panel in the main bottling room. The security is minimal. It's a civilian facility. The boat docked momentarily. Conrad and Petrov disembarked with a group of tourists while Margot remained aboard. They quickly separated from the group, Conrad guiding them toward a taxi stand. "We need to retrieve that evidence immediately," Conrad said as they drove away from the lake. "If your documentation proves Soviet tampering with Coca-Cola, it could expose an entire network of influence operations." Petrov nodded, removing his dark glasses to reveal bloodshot eyes. "The formulas they developed, they're subtle. Not mind control as you Americans like to imagine. Just a gentle nudge toward compatibility, openness. When consumed before negotiations, it creates a chemical predisposition toward agreement. Drugging diplomats through America's favorite beverage," Conrad muttered. "Ingenious and perverse simultaneously." The Coca-Cola bottling plant was located in an industrial area outside Zurich. The facility wasn't large. It served primarily as a distribution hub for imported concentrate that was then bottled and shipped throughout Switzerland and parts of Austria. They observed the plant from a neighboring business parking lot. The security was indeed minimal, a single guard at the front entrance and basic perimeter fencing. "There's a staff entrance on the south side," Petrov explained. "Workers use it for smoke breaks. The door is often propped open. And once inside, the maintenance panel is behind the main bottling line. It contains electrical controls that are rarely accessed. I placed the documentation in a waterproof container inside the panel." Conrad weighed their options. Daytime infiltration was risky, but waiting until night would give the KGB more time to close in. He made his decision. "We go now. I'll create a distraction at the main entrance. You slip in through the staff door, retrieve the documentation, and meet me at the cafe across the street in 15 minutes. "What if you're detained?" Petrov asked, fear evident in his voice. Conrad handed him a key. "Safe deposit box at Credit Suisse main branch. Box 447. If I don't return, get the documentation there. The bank manager has instructions to contact certain parties." The plan was simple but effective. Conrad approached the main entrance claiming to be from the American corporate office, demanding to speak with the manager about quality control issues. While the guard and receptionist were occupied with the angry American, Petrov slipped in through the side entrance. Conrad stretched his distraction as long as possible, eventually allowing himself to be placated with a tour of the facility's front offices. 14 minutes later, he spotted Petrov exiting the side door and walking calmly toward the cafe. After extricating himself from the plant manager, Conrad crossed to the cafe. Petrov sat at an outdoor table, a paper bag beside his coffee cup. His hands trembled as he sipped his drink. "You have it?" Conrad asked, sitting down. Petrov nodded toward the bag. "Everything. Formulas, implementation plans, distribution schedules. And the identity of Cardinal." Conrad felt a surge of adrenaline. "Who is it?" "James Wilton, Vice President of International Distribution for Coca-Cola. He's been working for the Soviets since 1956. Conrad's mind raced through the implications. A Soviet asset that highly placed in an iconic American company could do untold damage, not just through chemical manipulation but through economic intelligence. "We need to move. Now." Conrad left money for the coffees and stood. That's when he saw them. Two men in nondescript suits approaching from opposite directions. Their movements were too purposeful, too coordinated. "KGB. Walk. Don't run," Conrad instructed, guiding Petrov toward a busy shopping street. "When I say now, you turn right into the department store." Take the escalator up, then immediately take the service stairs down to the loading dock. They moved with deliberate casualness, but the KGB agents were closing in. As they neared the department store entrance, Conrad spotted a third agent taking position ahead of them. "Change of plan," he murmured. "Give me the bag. On my signal, you hail a taxi and go directly to the American consulate. Ask for Security Officer Davidson. Use the phrase Vienna sends regards." "What about you?" "I'm going to give them something to chase." As they passed a crowded bus stop, Conrad made his move. "Now!" He shoved the documentation into his own jacket, while Petrov stepped into the street, arm raised for a taxi. Conrad melted into the crowd at the bus stop just as one of the KGB agents broke into a run toward Petrov. The distraction worked. 2 agents followed Petrov's taxi while the third scanned the crowd, having lost sight of Conrad. When a bus arrived, Conrad boarded along with the surge of passengers, ducking low as he moved to a seat. He needed a secure location to examine the documentation before contacting Vienna. The Hotel Schweizerhof was compromised if the KGB had identified him. Conrad decided on a contingency location, a small pension in the old town where he'd stayed under a different identity during a previous operation. In his room at the pension, Conrad examined Petrov's evidence. The documentation was meticulous. Laboratory reports on compounds that created mild euphoria and increased suggestibility when combined with Coca-Cola's existing ingredients. Distribution plans showing which diplomatic functions were targeted. Communications between Cardinal and his Soviet handlers, including a payment schedule. Most damning was a recording of Wilton himself, discussing with someone in heavily accented English how certain batches would be specially prepared for the upcoming economic summit in Geneva. Conrad needed to get this information back to Langley immediately. He placed a call to a secure line in Vienna, using coded language to request an emergency extraction. "Package requires special handling," he said when Julia came on the line. "Contents will expire at Geneva gathering." "Understood," she replied. "Courier arriving Swiss Air Flight 114. Authentication: Alpine meadow blooms in winter. Response: only with careful cultivation. Extraction team for the package's originator? Already in alternate handling channel. Diplomatic pouch." The call complete, Conrad gathered the documentation and prepared to meet his courier. He still had several hours before the rendezvous and decided to use the time to create insurance. Using the pension's typewriter, he prepared 3 identical packages containing key evidence and summaries of the operation. These he addressed to different contacts, one to a journalist he trusted, one to a senior FBI official, and one to his former professor at Yale who had connections in Washington. If anything happened to him or the primary evidence, these packages would ensure the operation would still be exposed. As he worked, Conrad couldn't shake a growing sense of unease. The KGB's response had been too quick, too coordinated. They had been waiting for Petrov to make a move, which suggested they had intelligence on the defection operation from the beginning. There was a leak somewhere. Conrad left the pension an hour before the courier's flight was due, taking a circuitous route to the airport. He spotted no surveillance but remained cautious. At the airport, he positioned himself in the arrivals hall with clear sight lines to all entrances. Flight 114 from Vienna arrived on schedule. Conrad watched the passengers emerge, identifying his courier. A woman in her 30s carrying a distinctive red handbag, the agency's chosen recognition signal. He approached casually. "Lovely weather for April," he commented. "Yes, though alpine meadows bloom in winter," she replied. Something in her delivery felt wrong. Too rehearsed, too stiff. Conrad provided the countersign anyway. Only with careful cultivation. Her eyes showed no recognition of him, yet she knew the proper response. This was wrong. A professional courier would have been briefed with his description. "The package," she asked, her German accent now more pronounced than it should be for a Vienna station operative. Conrad made a split-second decision. Checking locker. Follow me. He led her toward the airport lockers, his mind racing. If she was compromised, the entire operation was in jeopardy. He needed confirmation. Vienna station still in the old location? He asked casually as they walked. Yes, of course, she replied without hesitation. The Vienna station had moved 3 months ago. She wasn't CIA. Conrad rounded a corner into a less populated corridor and changed direction abruptly, heading for a public restroom. Wait here, he instructed. Security sweep. Once inside, he moved quickly to the window. It was small but manageable. He forced it open and squeezed through, dropping 6 feet to a service area below. Ignoring the pain in his ankle, he limped rapidly toward the taxi stand, constantly scanning for pursuit. The safe house in Bern was his only option now. He needed to warn Vienna that the operation was compromised at the highest levels. How else would the Soviets have known to send a false courier? The leak had to be in Vienna or worse at Langley itself. The train to Bern was departing in 20 minutes. Conrad purchased a ticket and boarded, choosing a seat that allowed him to observe the platform until departure. No sign of pursuit, but that meant nothing. If the false courier had been professional enough to have the correct recognition phrase, her backup would be equally skilled. In Bern, Conrad went directly to the safe house, an apartment maintained by Swiss nationals sympathetic to Western intelligence. The elderly couple who owned it asked no questions when he used the appropriate cover story, simply showing him to a spare room and providing him with a key to the apartment. From a secure phone in the apartment, Conrad placed a call to an emergency number reserved for compromised operations. Authentication Delta 907 Tango, he said when the call connected. Verified, came the response. Report. Operation compromised at courier level. Evidence secured but Vienna connection suspect. Request direct Langley communication and alternate extraction. Stand by for callback in 30 minutes. Maintain isolation protocol. The 30 minutes passed with excruciating slowness. Conrad used the time to review Petrov's evidence again, focusing on James Wilton's role. The Coca-Cola executive had access to every international bottling facility and diplomatic function where the beverage was served. The potential damage was staggering. According to Petrov's notes, the modified formula had already been used at 3 diplomatic receptions in the past year, including a critical trade negotiation where the Soviets had secured surprisingly favorable terms. When the phone rang, Conrad answered immediately. Secure line to Langley established, said a voice he recognized as belonging to Deputy Director Harrington. Report directly Xander. Conrad provided a complete briefing detailing Petrov's defection, the evidence of Soviet tampering with Coca-Cola, and the compromised courier. Your assessment of the leak? Harrington asked. Someone with knowledge of courier protocols and my authentication codes. The compromise is in Vienna station or higher. Understood. Your extraction will proceed through channel Epsilon. Confirmation. The river runs coldest before dawn. Acknowledged. Response. But warms with the morning sun. Proceed to extraction point at 0600 tomorrow. Bring all evidence. The line went dead, and Conrad felt a momentary sense of relief. Langley was taking the situation seriously. The extraction would bypass Vienna station entirely, using a protocol reserved for the highest priority intelligence. He spent the night preparing the evidence for transport and destroying any trace of his presence in the safe house. At 4:30 a.m., he thanked his hosts and departed for the extraction point, a small airfield outside Bern used primarily for private aircraft. The morning was foggy, the airfield nearly deserted when he arrived. A single Cessna waited on the tarmac, its pilot performing pre-flight checks. Conrad approached cautiously, scanning for any sign of surveillance or ambush. "The river runs coldest before dawn," Conrad said when he reached the pilot. "But warms with the morning sun," the pilot replied without looking up from his checklist. "You're the only passenger. We depart in 10 minutes. Direct flight to USAF Ramstein. From there, military transport to Andrews." Conrad boarded the small aircraft, the evidence secure in his briefcase. As the plane taxied for takeoff, he allowed himself to consider the implications of what they'd uncovered. If the Soviets were drugging diplomats through America's most iconic product, what other methods might they be employing? The flight to Ramstein was uneventful. Upon landing, Conrad was met by 2 Air Force security officers who escorted him directly to a waiting C-130 military transport. No names were exchanged, only authentication codes. During the flight across the Atlantic, Conrad had time to reflect on the operation. Something still bothered him about the false courier. How had she known the exact recognition phrases? The leak had to be someone with direct knowledge of his mission parameters. At Andrews Air Force Base, a car was waiting to transport him directly to CIA headquarters at Langley. The driver was silent throughout the journey, and Conrad maintained his vigilance. Trust no one until the leak was identified. Director of Central Intelligence Alan Warner met him personally in a secure conference room. Warner, a career intelligence officer with a reputation for thoroughness, wasted no time on pleasantries. "The evidence," he demanded, extending his hand. Conrad placed his briefcase on the table but didn't open it. "Sir, before I surrender this, I need to address the security breach. The courier who attempted to make contact in Zurich had the correct recognition phrases. That information was limited to this operation." Warner's expression hardened. "We've been conducting an internal investigation since your emergency call. The breach has been identified and contained." "Who?" Warner hesitated, then sighed. "Julia Vaughn, your Vienna contact." Conrad felt as if he'd been struck. "Impossible. She's been my handler for months." "And reporting to Moscow for years," Warner said grimly. "We've had suspicions about a mole in Vienna station. Your compromised operation confirmed it. She was arrested this morning." Conrad struggled to process this revelation. Julia, the woman he'd trusted, had even begun to care for, was a Soviet agent. Every operation she'd touched was now suspect. "The Coca-Cola operation," Conrad said, refocusing. "How far has it spread? That's what we need to determine." Warner gestured to the briefcase. Conrad opened it and laid out Petrov's evidence. The director examined the documents with growing concern. "If these formulas are accurate, the Soviets have been influencing diplomatic negotiations through chemical means for at least a year." Warner picked up the recording of James Wilton. "And with an asset this highly placed, the entire international diplomatic community could be compromised," Conrad finished. "Where is Petrov now?" "Safe at the consulate in Zurich. At least that was the plan." Warner nodded. "He's been extracted separately, currently debriefing with our chemical division." He gathered the documents. "This goes directly to the president. The implications are staggering." "What happens to Coca-Cola?" Conrad asked. "That's the delicate part. We can't create a public panic by revealing that the Soviets have been tampering with America's favorite beverage. The economic damage would be catastrophic." Warner straightened his tie. "But we also can't allow this operation to continue." 2 days later, Conrad sat in a secure room at Langley, watching a closed-circuit broadcast of a press conference. James Wilton was being led away in handcuffs, his arrest announced as related to industrial espionage. No mention was made of Soviet connections or chemical tampering. Julia Vaughn would never face public charges. Like most exposed intelligence officers, she would simply disappear into the system, her fate determined behind closed doors through prisoner exchanges or clandestine negotiations. Petrov had been granted asylum and a new identity. His knowledge of Soviet chemical warfare techniques made him too valuable to risk losing. As for Coca-Cola itself, the company had cooperated fully once confronted with evidence of Wilton's betrayal. A complete security overhaul of international operations was underway, with CIA oversight of all bottling facilities in diplomatic settings. The door opened, and Director Warner entered with another man Conrad didn't recognize. "Conrad Xander, meet Robert Goizueta from Coca-Cola," Warner said. "He's been cleared for limited knowledge of the operation." Goizueta, a Cuban-born executive with intense eyes, shook Conrad's hand firmly. "The company owes you a debt we can never publicly acknowledge. We've been discussing an interesting counter-operation," Warner explained. "Rather than simply shutting down the Soviet effort, we're proposing something more creative." Goizueta nodded eagerly. "If the Soviets believe our product can influence diplomatic negotiations toward peace, perhaps we can use that to our advantage." "You want to continue the modified formula?" Conrad asked incredulously. "Not their formula," Warner clarified. "Our own version. Harmless, of course, mostly sugar and caffeine with trace compounds that create a sense of well-being. Nothing that wouldn't already be in a soft drink." "Psychological warfare through carbonation," Conrad said, beginning to understand. "Exactly. Let the Soviets think their operation continues, but with our control. Every summit, every negotiation, they'll believe they're gaining an advantage through chemical means, while actually consuming nothing more than a slightly sweeter Coca-Cola. The placebo effect," Goizueta added. "If they believe it works, it creates an expectation of successful negotiations." Conrad considered the elegant simplicity of the plan. So Coca-Cola becomes a tool for détente rather than subversion. "A beverage tactic for peace," Warner said with the ghost of a smile. "Sometimes the best counterintelligence isn't stopping the enemy's operation. It's redirecting it to serve our purposes." 1 year later, Conrad stood at the back of a conference room in Geneva, watching Soviet and American diplomats toast the signing of a minor but meaningful arms limitation agreement. Each held a glass of Coca-Cola, served from bottles that had been carefully prepared under what the CIA now called Operation Harmony, appropriating the Soviet code name for their own purposes. The Soviet delegation leader smiled as he sipped his drink, unaware that the formula he believed was making Americans more pliable was actually nothing more than the world's most famous soft drink, its psychological effect now working in reverse on the Soviets themselves. Julia Vaughn had been exchanged 6 months earlier for 2 American agents held in East Germany. Conrad had requested to be present at the exchange but was denied. Some endings were best left incomplete. Petrov had been relocated to a research position at a private laboratory in California, his expertise now serving Western interests under a new identity. And Conrad himself had received a promotion, though the details of his operation would remain classified for decades. The Cold War continued its dangerous dance, but in this small corner of the conflict, America had gained an unexpected advantage. As the diplomats raised their glasses in another toast, Conrad caught the eye of his CIA colleague across the room. They shared a knowing look, guardians of a secret tactic that turned an iconic American product into an instrument of peace through one of the Cold War's most unusual deceptions.